My name is Selene, and I remember the exact sound of the laughter that finally broke me. It was a soft afternoon in June, the kind that wraps its arms around the sky with the warmth of forgiveness, but not for me. I was sitting at the long teakwood family table, surrounded by people who called themselves kin, but never once learned how to pronounce my worth. They called it a gathering. I called it a test. Gregory, my then husband, was seated 2 chairs down, half listening to his sister Vanessa recall a story that ended, like always, with a smirk and a punchline at someone else's expense. This time, the target was me, again. We were discussing design. I had just landed a modest contract, nothing massive. But it was mine, real, earned, and honest. I spoke with calm pride, just beginning to explain the client's vision, the identity I was helping them shape when Vanessa interrupted. If Celine disappeared tomorrow, she said, lifting her wine glass, who would even notice? There was a pause, the kind that usually precedes an apology. But then came the laughter. Patricia, the matriarch, hiding her smirk behind the lip of her glass. Richard, the empire builder, guffawing as though cruelty was currency. And Gregory, he laughed too, not hard, just enough to betray me. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I raised my glass water. Not wine, and said, challenge accepted. It was the cleanest break I ever made. You see, when people think about heartbreak, they imagine shouting, slamming doors, dramatic exits, but some heartbreaks are silent. They don't roar, they hum quietly, persistently, until they become a frequency you can't live with anymore. That night, I packed my life into 3 suitcases and a duffel bag, left the diamond ring on the kitchen counter beside a note that said only this. Watch what happens when you stop clapping for the wrong audience. I left behind 7 years of duty, 7 years of watching my light flicker under their dimmed expectations. And I left without asking for anyone's permission. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that permission is the currency of the unfulfilled. I drove west. I didn't know where I was going, only that it couldn't be there. The road stretched out like an artery toward my freedom. And for the first time in what felt like decades, I could breathe without adjusting who I was to fit the room I was in. That was the beginning of the rise, not the loud, cinematic kind you see in films, but the slow, bone-deep kind, the kind that begins not with motivation, but clarity. They say discipline starts with a decision. That's only half true. It starts with disgust. The first few weeks, I didn't post a single thing online. No cryptic status. No quote about healing. No curated sadness. Because I wasn't healing yet, I was dismantling. I was taking apart every lie I had let them dress me in. Every compromise I'd made in the name of family. Every time I was told that what I did was cute instead of real. I got a small apartment. The kind where the faucet leaks and the paint peels. But the silence inside is honest. I got a fold-out desk, set up my laptop, reached out to every old contact I had and every new one I didn't know yet. I built a new portfolio. Clean, sharp, true to my voice. I stopped trying to impress and started trying to express. There were no overnight wins. No viral moments. Just long nights, cold coffee, quiet panic. Rebuilding yourself isn't noble, it's gritty. It's scary. It's often humiliating. But here's what nobody tells you. Rock bottom is a stable foundation if you dare to build there. 3 months in, I landed a contract with a small wellness brand. They didn't know the Caldwells. They didn't care who my ex-husband was. They liked my color theory. They loved my honesty. They gave me full creative control. The campaign went better than any of us expected. Word spread. A friend of theirs called. Then another. Within 6 months, I wasn't chasing work anymore. It was finding me. I didn't shout about my comeback. I whispered it in fonts and pixels. I let my designs speak the words I had once silenced. Gregory never reached out. Not really. He sent one email formal. Stiff. I hope you're well. It read like a memo. Not a memory. I deleted it. Amanda posted photos from the next family dinner. Same smiles, same wine glasses, same jokes. But no one made the shortcake I used to bring. No one set a place where I used to sit. And no one mentioned the echo I left behind. But I didn't vanish. I was becoming... There's something sacred about solitude when it's chosen. Not loneliness, not isolation, but solitude, the kind that sharpens your edges and makes your silence speak louder than their applause ever did. I began waking up before dawn, not because I had to, but because something inside me refused to sleep through my second chance. Every morning felt like a quiet contract. Show up or stay small, and I was done being small. Seattle rain became my rhythm. The sound against my window was steadier than any of their promises. The studio apartment, with its chipped tiles and fogged mirrors, became a cocoon where the woman they thought had disappeared was quietly drafting her reintroduction. I didn't track my revenge on social media. I tracked it on spreadsheets, in contracts, in deposits with my name on them. My website traffic climbed. A small design blog featured my branding work. One day, a company out of New York reached out. They had seen my work on a boutique tea company I'd rebranded. We want that clarity. The email said, Ding. That voice, funny. The voice they once told me was too quiet. The designs they once said were just a phase. The woman they once said wouldn't be missed. She was beginning to make noise. But here's the secret to rising. You can't rise in resentment. You rise in release. I didn't rise because I hated them. I rose because I stopped believing them. I stopped believing that love must always come at the cost of self. I stopped believing that silence equals strength. I stopped believing that being invited means you belong. And when you stop believing in their world, you start building your own. That winter, I was invited to speak at a regional design conference. Nothing massive, but it was the first time in years I stood in front of strangers and spoke as Selene, not as Gregory's wife. I remember standing behind the curtain, hands shaking, heart pounding like it hadn't in a decade. I wasn't nervous. I was alive. The lights hit, the mic crackled, and I told my story. Not the gossip version, not the pity version. Just the truth. How I disappeared. How I rebuilt. How I rediscovered the woman I buried beneath 7 years of subtle submission. I didn't name names, but I didn't spare the lessons either. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She looked 23. Maybe younger? Your story, she hesitated. I think I'm still in the middle of it. I looked her dead in the eyes and said the words I wish someone had said to me sooner. Start walking now. No one's coming to rescue you, but the future, you. She's waiting. Rebuilding didn't mean perfection. There were moments of fear. Doubt. The occasional 3A. Panic spiral. There were times I almost called Gregory, not out of longing, out of muscle memory. But I didn't, because every time I missed the familiarity of my old life, I remembered the table, the laughter, the glass in my hand, the silence after my words, challenge accepted. It wasn't rage that fueled me. It was remembrance. Remembrance of who I used to be before I asked anyone else for permission to shine. I began a personal project, one design every Sunday. No clients, no edits, just me. My ideas, my truth. I called it the Permission Series. It went viral. People didn't know the backstory. They didn't need to. The art spoke for itself. It dripped with rebirth. Somewhere during all this, I bought a used car, learned how to unclog my own sink, started drinking my coffee black, not because I liked it, but because it reminded me that I could change. I was no longer crafting my life for approval. I was building it for alignment. The strange thing about growing is this. People will try to pull you back, not out of cruelty, but out of confusion. They recognize the version of you that served them, not the one that saves you. And the ones who only loved you when you were smaller, they don't survive the expansion. A year after I left, I got an email from a large brand, a national food company. They'd seen my wellness branding work, wanted to bring me on to reimagine their new organic line. The agency managing the project, a firm partially owned by Richard Caldwell. Funny how the universe loops. For a moment, I hesitated. Was this bait? A backdoor? An apology wrapped in professional pretense? But then I remembered I'm not here to avoid the past. I'm here to prove it doesn't define me. I signed the contract, and I showed up not as a victim of their laughter, but as the architect of a life they could never touch. The day of the industry gala was cool, overcast, but the air was charged with something unnameable. Not anxiety, not excitement, just presence, a sense that something long overdue was finally arriving. I wore a tailored midnight blue jumpsuit, not a dress. I wasn't there to fit in. I was there to take up space. My hair, shorter now, framed a face no longer seeking approval. The designer heels weren't for them, they were for the 3A. Celine, who stayed up learning brand psychology because no one else believed in her vision. They were for the Selene who once cried in the pantry of a 5-bedroom house because her dessert wasn't display table appropriate. They were for me. When I arrived, the lights were warm, diffused, like a film set. But softer. I walked in alone. No Gregory on my arm. No Patricia whispering names behind a flute of champagne. I was not the +1 anymore. I was the name on the list. Thomas, the creative director from the agency, waved me over. Your segment's right after the keynote. He said, we've got a prime slot. I nodded. No nerves. Just readiness. A year ago, I was invisible at their table. Tonight, I was about to take the stage they considered their domain. As I made my way through the crowd, I spotted them. Richard, Patricia, Amanda, Gregory. The Caldwells, dressed in polished confidence, standing in their usual triangle of power. They didn't see me at first because they weren't looking. When they finally did, it was Amanda who blinked first. Her eyes scanned my outfit. My posture, the badge on my chest that read, Lead Creative Westwood for Sheffield rebrand. Gregory's mouth opened slightly, the way it did when he couldn't find the right words. Only this time, he didn't try, he just watched. Patricia's smile faltered for a half-second. Then recovered. Richard's eyes narrowed in a way that only meant one thing. Surprise, but no one said a word, and neither did I. Because this was never about confrontation. This was about confirmation. When my segment was announced, the lights shifted and I walked to the stage without glancing in their direction. I told the room the story of a brand that needed to rediscover its voice. I showed visuals that connected authenticity to growth. I laid out strategy with the quiet conviction of someone who's lived every slide. And I did it all with calm fire. When I finished, the applause wasn't just polite, it was electric. The kind of clapping that's not for the slides, but for the story behind them, the kind of clapping that says, we see you, and we needed that. Back at my table, Thomas leaned in. That was the best presentation of the night. I thanked him, sipping sparkling water like it was champagne. Because success doesn't always need to be toasted with alcohol. Yeah, sometimes clarity is intoxicating enough. I caught Amanda watching me from across the room. Not with venom, but with something closer to disbelief. A recalibration. The realization that the person they used to mock for trying too hard had built a brand without borrowing a single drop of their prestige. Later that evening, Gregory approached, his hands in his pockets. Like always, his posture sheepish. Like sometimes, you look, he started, different. I offered, no. He shook his head, like you finally stepped into yourself. I nodded. That's because I did. He swallowed. I didn't know you had this in you. I smiled. That's because you were too busy laughing. He looked down. That old shame again. But this time, I didn't need it to land. He didn't owe me anything, and I didn't need anything from him. This wasn't a moment of reconciliation. It was a moment of recognition. Amanda passed by us a moment later, paused. Your work is strong, she said, her voice tight. I met her eyes and nodded once. Thank you. And that was it. No apology, no olive branch, just the unsettling understanding that I had become someone whose silence now thundered louder than their noise. I left the event with nothing but my clutch and my dignity. No business cards crammed in my hand. No compliments clung to like lifeboats. Just a steady heartbeat and the echo of my own power in every step I took away from that ballroom. Later that night, in the stillness of my apartment, I wrote something down, a note for no one but me. You don't need to prove you're enough to people committed to misunderstanding you. You just need to become undeniable. I pinned it above my desk. Because this wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a life authored on my terms. The next morning came not with fanfare, but with light. Golden, delicate light that bled through the slats of my blinds and rested across the floor like an answered prayer. I stood barefoot in the quiet of my apartment, still half-dressed from the night before, staring at the untouched bottle of wine I'd brought home just in case I felt like celebrating. Not because the night wasn't victorious, but because I didn't need wine to mark the moment. My presence had done that already. The room had seen me. They had seen me, not the woman they remembered, not the wife. The +1, the laughingstock behind the jokes, but the woman who left, who built something they couldn't reduce, and returned not to ask for acknowledgement, but to demonstrate command. That morning, I didn't check social media. I didn't wait to see if they posted anything. I didn't wonder what they were saying. Because I was no longer living in reaction. I was living in rhythm. Mina. I made coffee. Real coffee. The kind you brew slowly. Deliberately. Like a ritual. And I sat at my desk in that same creaky chair I'd bought secondhand 2 years ago when I couldn't afford anything better. And I opened my inbox. 57 new messages. Some were business inquiries, potential clients. Collaborators, follow-ups from the gala, but a few came from people I hadn't expected. One was from Charlotte Michael's wife, the pediatric surgeon, one of the only people in that family who ever looked at me with anything resembling decency. Her message was brief. Selene, I've always respected your grace. I watched your presentation last night with pride, not as a Caldwell. As a woman, let me know if you'd ever be open to coffee off the record. Another was from someone named Elise, a junior staffer at the Caldwell firm. Apparently, her message made me pause. I know you don't know me, but I work under Amanda. I just wanted to say, you inspired me last night. I've been thinking about quitting for a year. Watching you made me realize I don't want to stay invisible. Thank you. I stared at that screen for a long time. You never know who's watching when you reclaim your voice. That afternoon, I went for a walk by the water. The air was brisk. The clouds thick. The sea that beautiful slate gray it wears in winter. And I let myself remember things I hadn't in a while. I remembered the time I cried in the bathroom because Patricia said my dress looked homemade. I remembered how Amanda once gave Gregory's ex-girlfriend a toast at our wedding reception. I remembered how, after my miscarriage, Gregory told me maybe it was a blessing because now we could focus on his Tokyo opportunity. These were not memories. These were monuments, each one a brick in the wall I had to climb over just to see myself clearly again. But I didn't linger there long. Pain is a good teacher, but a terrible roommate. So I walked on, past the docks, past the couples holding hands, past the old man feeding gulls on the bench with a wrinkled paper bag, until I found my spot, a wooden overlook that stretched above the bay. I stood there, wind curling through my coat, and let the weight lift. It didn't drop. It didn't explode. It just lifted, because I had nothing to prove anymore. Not to Gregory, not to Amanda, not to Patricia or Richard or anyone else who once pretended that keeping me small was an act of love. I had built a life with roots, not performances. With partners, not puppeteers. With clarity, not compromise. And they couldn't touch it. The months that followed passed like chapters I never thought I'd get to write. I moved out of the studio, bought a small house, not a mansion, not a statement, just a sanctuary. One I paid for with money earned from contracts that bore my name. I hired a junior designer. Then two, started mentoring at a local art college. And once, on a whim, I even created a piece titled, "The Table They Laughed At." It was minimalist, a long table, a single chair pulled away from it, surrounded by faded silhouettes. But at the edge, beyond the canvas, A golden line, like a beam of light, pointed toward an open door. It went viral. People shared it with captions like, "This is how I left. This is how I healed. This is me." And that was the full circle moment. Wasn't it? Not the night I stood on stage, not the business wins, not even the apartment turned office turned real home. It was knowing that my life, once invisible, now reflected light back to others. That the woman who once raised a hot dog in a toast of defiance had become a quiet lighthouse. A warning, a signal, a promise. You don't have to stay where you're not seen. You don't have to shrink to keep the peace. You don't have to sit at their table to be fed. You can build your own, and you can decorate it with the fire they tried to extinguish. There are moments, even now, when the echoes return. A name on a podcast, an old family friend's tag in a mutual post, the unexpected ping of memory when someone orders the same wine Patricia used to drink at every dinner. But the difference now is that these echoes don't hurt. They don't sting. They simply pass through, like wind brushing against stone, no longer carving, just gliding. I'd like to say forgiveness came easily, but it didn't. It never does. Forgiveness is not a switch you flip. It's a muscle you build slowly, painfully, deliberately, until one day, the weight doesn't pull the same way. Forgiveness didn't mean I let them back in. It didn't mean I sought closure or craved apology. It meant I stopped bleeding from wounds they no longer had the power to reopen. And part of that forgiveness, the most painful part, was forgiving myself. For staying too long, for silencing my own voice, for mistaking manipulation for manners, and cruelty for culture, for calling it loyalty when really, it was fear. The Selene I am now doesn't beg for love in the language of sacrifice. She speaks in boundaries, in clarity, in radiant non-negotiables. I remember reading once that when a flower doesn't bloom, you don't blame the flower. You change the environment. That's what I had done. I had changed the soil. And now, I was blooming where their roots could never reach. A few weeks after the conference, I received a formal proposal. Richard's firm, the same one that once condescended to my little business, wanted to partner on a new campaign for a high-end eco-beauty brand. I reviewed the document 3 times before I replied. And then I did something unexpected. I said yes. Not out of spite, not out of strategy, but because this time, it would be on my terms. The kickoff meeting was scheduled in their towering office downtown, the same building I had once walked into through the back entrance to drop off Gregory's forgotten briefcase, wearing jeans and guilt, feeling like a shadow. Now, I entered through the front, head high, contract in hand. When I walked into the conference room, Amanda was already seated. She stood when I arrived, offered a nod, not warm, not cold, just present. Selene, she said. Welcome back. I'm not back, I replied calmly, laying my portfolio on the table. I'm here. She understood the distinction. The meeting was brief. Professional, no side glances, no sarcasm. Just business. As I packed up to leave, Amanda hesitated. That piece, the table they laughed at, I saw it. I waited. She continued. It made me think maybe we never saw you clearly. I shrugged gently. That's all right. I didn't see myself clearly either. Back then, that was the truth. We were all looking at ghost versions of ourselves we thought were fixed. She didn't offer an apology. I didn't need one. Some things don't end in a bourg. They end in balance. It's strange, isn't it? How the things that once broke you become the very soil where your new life grows. That table, the teakwood one, the last place I ever sat as less than, it still exists. I'm sure still hosts dinners, still holds wine glasses and polished silver. But I don't wonder about it anymore, because I've built a new table. It's smaller, quieter, but every chair is earned, every voice is heard, and every toast is sincere. Sometimes I think about the version of me who raised that hot dog in defiance. She had no plan, no roadmap, no guarantees, but she had a spark, a single, trembling act of resistance that would become a revolution. Shh, I owe everything to her. So if you're listening to this, and you're still sitting at the table where your presence is questioned, If you're still shrinking to fit into the stories others wrote for you, if you're still waiting for their laughter to turn into respect, here's what I'll tell you. Walk away, quietly, clearly, completely, not to punish them, but to find the version of you that doesn't ask for permission anymore, the version who knows that disappearing isn't defeat. It's the first step toward becoming. It was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable to most, but I remember it like a coronation. I was barefoot in my new kitchen, sipping coffee, flipping through proofs for a luxury skincare line I'd just signed. The client had given me full creative direction, no revisions. No compromises, no diluted vision. They said, "We want your eyes on this. Celine." Your voice, not Gregory's name, not the Caldwell influence. Just me. My phone buzzed. A simple notification. Project feature. Top 10 branding campaigns of the year. Mine was number 3. I didn't scream. I didn't post a celebration selfie. I just smiled. Because there's a certain kind of joy that doesn't need to be broadcast. It settles in your bones. Later that day, I lit a candle in my office. Not for luck. Not for a ritual, but for reverence. For the version of me that never stopped showing up even when no one clapped, even when the room went cold. I walked to my studio window and looked out at the street below. People moving, coffee carts clinking, cyclists weaving between buses, life full and undistracted, just like mine now. The irony, of course, is that they did me a favor. Vanessa, Patricia, Gregory. Their laughter was a prophecy they never intended to fulfill. If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice. And yet, by disappearing, I became undeniable. By stepping out of their light, I found my own. Months passed, and the campaign launched to critical acclaim. I was invited to speak at design schools, business forums, women's leadership panels. People wanted to know the secret. There wasn't one. No shortcuts. No hacks. Just one brutal truth. You rise when you finally decide to stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. I began writing a book, not a memoir. Not yet, but a creative manifesto. A guide for anyone who's ever sat at the wrong table. Wearing a smile stitched from fear and performance. I titled it, "The Other Seat, When They Don't Save You a Spot. Build Your Own Stage." In one chapter, I described the moment I left Gregory. In another, I described the first client who didn't care about my past, only my portfolio. In every sentence, I wove the thread of liberation, not loud, not angry, just firm, earned, and alive. I wasn't telling people how to be brave. I was reminding them they already are. One day, as spring arrived in Seattle, cherry blossoms bursting like confetti over cracked sidewalks, I got a letter in the mail. Handwritten. It was from Gregory. His handwriting hadn't changed. Neither had the careful loops on my name. But the tone was different. Selene, I've watched from afar. I've listened to the things I never heard when you were beside me. I realize now that your silence wasn't passive. It was protective. You were never too sensitive. We were simply too careless. I don't expect a reply. But I wanted to say that I finally understand. And I hope wherever you are, you're laughing freely. This time, I folded the letter once, twice, and tucked it into my journal. Not because I needed the validation, but because it was a relic, a final artifact from the life I once lived. A story now closed, but never erased. It's funny how revenge never tastes the way you imagine. It isn't served cold. It's served quiet. It's the silence when their names no longer trigger your pulse. It's the stillness when you realize you don't need them to know your worth anymore. It's the joy of waking up and not adjusting your volume, your wardrobe, or your words to survive. It's not about returning to confront them. It's about returning to yourself. Today, my calendar is full. My phone rings with purpose. Not panic. My walls are covered in art that doesn't apologize. I still keep one photo on my desk, not of the Caldwells. And not of Gregory. Not even of me on stage. It's a photo of me, alone, In that first apartment, hair messy, eyes tired, sitting on the floor next to a half-assembled IKEA desk. Laptop open, design window glowing. It's not glamorous. B. But it's sacred, because that was the moment I bet on myself. And every moment since has been the proof that I won. So if you're still sitting at their table, listening to their jokes, biting your tongue until it bleeds, hear this. You don't have to stay, you don't have to earn their kindness. You don't have to perform for their scraps of recognition. You don't have to laugh at jokes meant to erase you. You can leave, you can build, you can bloom. And when you do, they won't be able to touch it. Not because you're hiding, but because you're flying